What if everything you know about your name, your identity, and even where you come from was quietly changed not that long ago without anyone ever telling you? This video is about a strange shift that happened in the 1800s. A moment in history where names started to change, maps were redrawn, and entire groups of people seemed to disappear from the story, as if someone had gone back and edited the record without leaving a clear explanation behind. There is one name at the center of this mystery, a name that used to appear on maps across huge parts of the world, printed clearly for anyone to see, and yet today, most people have never even heard of it or have been told it never really meant anything important. If you go back and look at old maps from before the 1800s, you will find massive regions labeled as Tartaria, covering areas that today are known by completely different names, which raises a simple but uncomfortable question, because if those lands had a name before, why was it replaced, and why is it no longer part of the story we are taught? And here is where things start to get even more interesting, because this was not just a small update or a normal change over time. This was a fast and widespread shift happening across different regions, where identities were redefined, histories were rewritten, and people were suddenly categorized in new ways. It is as if the world went through a silent reset. So the real question is not just what Tartaria was, but why its name disappeared and what took its place. Because if something that big can be removed from history, then it forces us to wonder what else may have been changed along the way. And more importantly, it makes you ask a deeper question, one that is hard to ignore once it enters your mind, which is if names shape identity, and identity shapes who we believe we are, then what happens when the names themselves are changed? To understand how something like this could even happen, we need to go back to a time before the 1800s, when the world was not organized the way we know it today, and when large parts of the map were described using broad names that represented regions, cultures, and groups of people rather than clearly defined countries with strict borders. During that period, the term Tartaria appeared frequently in maps produced by different European cartographers, not as a small or isolated place, but as a vast area that stretched across northern Asia and beyond, often labeled as Great Tartary, which suggests that it was recognized as something significant, even if not fully understood by those documenting it. As the 1800s unfold, we start to see the rise of modern nation-states, with borders becoming more precise, governments becoming more centralized, and identities becoming more controlled and standardized, which may sound like progress, but also creates the perfect conditions for older names and broader identities to be replaced. Instead of large, undefined regions, the world begins to be divided into specific countries, each with its own official name, language, and narrative. And as this process accelerates, older labels like Tartaria start to disappear from maps, textbooks, and official records. Within a relatively short period of time, something that once covered a huge portion of the known world is no longer recognized in the same way. And in its place, we see the emergence of names and identities that feel familiar to us today, but may not have existed in that form before. At the same time, this period is marked by major global changes, including industrialization, expansion of empires, and the development of modern systems of education, all of which play a role in shaping how history is recorded and taught. This leads us to an important turning point in the story, because now we are no longer just looking at old maps. We are starting to see a pattern where the restructuring of the world is happening alongside a restructuring of identity itself, raising the possibility that the disappearance of certain names may not be random, but part of a much larger transformation. Now let's bring this back to what really matters, because the core of this story is not just about a forgotten name on a map, but about what happens when names themselves begin to change. Sim, aparentemente simples pode, ao longo do tempo, alterar completamente a forma como as pessoas se enxergam e entendem suas próprias origens. During the 1800s, the world vai muito além de guerras ou avanços tecnológicos, envolvendo principalmente a forma como as pessoas passam a ser registradas, classificadas e reconhecidas oficialmente, e é nesse momento que os nomes deixam de ser algo orgânico, ligado à tradição local ou familiar, e passam a ser tratados como parte de um sistema organizado, controlado e padronizado por governos. Last names begin to be fixed, often for the first time in many regions, as states start requiring consistent surnames for taxation, census records, and legal identification, and in this process, countless families have their names altered, simplified, translated, or completely replaced. Não por escolha pessoal, mas para se encaixar em padrões administrativos que precisavam funcionar em larga escala. In some cases, a name that once described a place, a role, or a lineage is shortened to fit official documents, while in others, names are adapted to match the dominant language of a region, and there are also situations where entirely new surnames are assigned, breaking the direct link between a person and the deeper history that name once carried. And when you step back and look at this happening across millions of people, across different countries over just a few generations, it stops being a small adjustment and starts to look like a massive restructuring of identity, where the past is not necessarily erased but is gradually reformatted into something new, something easier to manage but also more distant from its original form. This is why the question becomes bigger than any single term or theory, because even if we remove Tartaria from the discussion entirely, the pattern still exists, showing that the 1800s were not just about changing maps, but about redefining people at a fundamental level through something as simple and powerful as a name. And once a name is changed, recorded and repeated over time, it does more than identify you. It begins to define the story you believe about where you come from. Once names become fixed, recorded and standardized, something subtle but very powerful begins to happen. Because identity stops being something that evolves naturally within families and communities, and starts to be shaped by systems that decide how people should be seen, categorized, and remembered over time. When a government writes your name into a registry, that version of you becomes the official one, and from that point forward, everything connected to your existence, from legal records to historical traces, begins to follow that standardized identity, even if it no longer reflects where you truly came from. Over time, this creates a quiet separation between lived history and recorded history, where traditions, oral stories, and original meanings attached to names begin to fade, while the official version becomes stronger, more accepted, and harder to question, especially as new generations grow up only knowing what has been documented. And this is where the long-term effect becomes clear, because when millions of people go through this process, the result is not just a change in naming patterns, but a gradual shift in how entire populations understand their roots, their ancestry, and their place in the world. It becomes easier to group people into nations, easier to define borders, easier to build unified narratives about who belongs where. But at the same time, it becomes harder to trace back the deeper layers of identity that existed before everything was standardized. This does not require a conspiracy to happen. It can emerge naturally from the need to organize societies that were becoming larger, more complex and more controlled, but the outcome still leads to the same place, which is a version of identity that is cleaner, more structured, and yet, in many cases, less connected to its original form. And when you combine this with the rewriting of maps, the creation of modern education systems and the repetition of official narratives over decades, you begin to see how powerful this transformation really was. Because it did not just change what people were called, it changed how they understood themselves. So when we look back at the 1800s, the real impact may not be what was removed from history, but how what remained was reorganized into a new framework, one that still defines identity today, often without being questioned. Which brings us to the final step, because once you understand how names can shape identity, the question is no longer just about the past, but about how much of that past is still influencing who you believe you are right now. When you put all of this together, the picture becomes much clearer, not as a mystery filled with hidden empires or lost civilizations, but as a large-scale transformation that reshaped how the world organizes identity, and, more importantly, how individuals relate to their own past. The 1800s were a turning point where names stopped being fluid markers of local culture and became fixed tools of administration, and while this brought efficiency, structure and control to growing societies, it also introduced a layer of distance between people and the deeper origins of their identity. This means that the name shift was real, not as a sudden rewrite of history in secret, but as a gradual and documented process tied to the rise of modern states, bureaucracy, and standardized systems that required consistency across millions of individuals. And once that system is in place, it reinforces itself. Each generation inherits the same names, the same categories, and the same recorded histories, making the new structure feel natural, permanent, and unquestionable, even though it was at one point a constructed transition. So instead of asking whether something was erased in a dramatic or hidden way, a more grounded conclusion is this: the past was reorganized, simplified, and standardized to fit a new model of society, and in that process, complexity was reduced. Local identity was compressed, and certain connections to older forms of identification were inevitably lost. This does not mean that history is false, but it does mean that it is filtered, shaped by the systems that record it, and influenced by the needs of the time in which it was written. And when you understand that, the title stops being a question and starts to become a statement. The shift in names did not rewrite who we are completely, but it did redefine how we understand who we are. And that difference, although subtle, changes everything. If you enjoy this kind of content and want to see more videos like this, just follow the channel and stay with us for the next ones.